I extend a warm welcome to the viewers of this program. This is the first in the series of lectures on the novel Wuthering by Emily Bronte. In these lectures, we would be critically looking at the text and the context of the novel Wuthering Heights. As you probably already know, Wuthering Heights is a canonical text of the 19th century. It has become a classic now. At one level, it is about love and revenge, but really at another, it is a comment on the social crisis that gripped England in the 19th century. This crisis led to distortions in human life and relationships, disrupting the very fabric of society. Let's revisit this crisis in some detail, particularly from the point of view of a woman novelist. So today, we will discuss women's fiction in 19th century England and more specifically, the problems faced by women writers during the period. What was life like for women in England in the 19th century? Historians tell us that the rise of the middle class, a new section of women came up. With the rise of the middle class, a new section of women came up who were expected to read a great deal and expand their knowledge enough to make a conversation with men, and finally to be able to marry well. That is all that was expected of women. As you can understand, they were not supposed to read to expand their knowledge or to increase their intellect. Rather, they were supposed to read enough so they could make a conversation with men and only have enough knowledge of certain subjects. Again, what subjects they could read and talk about was also limited. And then therefore, when this process of spreading education, again formal education was not something that women could get. They were either schooled at home or they had governesses. They were sometimes sent to boarding schools. Mostly they were homeschooled. And yet, when you have women who have attained some knowledge by reading, by gathering some information through books that were made available to them because of their fathers or brothers, you had a category of women who became ambitious and flaunted their knowledge. They dabbled with politics and social issues way too much, and interestingly, they were termed the blue stocking. Now you might ask, what is a blue stocking? So women who boasted their knowledge and dominated conversations with men, they actually assumed the air of an intellectual. And in assuming the air of an intellectual, such women were seen as taking the natural attribute of men, namely intelligence, and therefore they were considered unfeminine. Because intellect was the man's domain, because intellect belonged to men. So they were behaving in an unnatural manner by showing off their intelligence. And therefore these women were considered unfeminine. And of course, because they were unfeminine, because they had a lot of knowledge, therefore they were also considered unfit for marriage. And as I told you earlier, the whole process of gaining education was to be able to make a conversation and also to be able to marry well so that you could make an impression on men. So 19th century life really was very different in that sense from what we understand today of women's situation in the West, particularly in England. So women were supposed to read basically, but not too much. Also in the 19th century, women were supposed to be proficient in modern languages, particularly French, conversational French at least, and also in being able to play the piano, painting, drawing, with some knowledge of the culinary skills. All this made them perfect, eligible women for marriage. I take this example from, for instance, you must have all read Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, right? And in Pride and Prejudice, there is Caroline Bingley who, gives us the attributes of an accomplished woman. And according to her, she says that a woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing. Besides all this, she must have possessed a certain something in her air and also in the manner of her walking and the tone of her voice. So women were supposed to do all of this. They were supposed to know music, they were supposed to be able to sing, draw, dance well. Had to have some kind of an air, a kind of an elegance and grace in their manner of walking, in their posture, and in their person as such. So this was the expectation of society from women of the 19th century. Women were supposed to know languages, but again, you see, if you notice, this is the domain of domesticity also, right? For women, they are kept away from politics, science, etc. I'll come to this in a bit when we discuss how there were feminists who believed that women were deliberately kept out of politics, mathematics, and science, and that rational thought was taken away from them, and they were only given a sort of a limited knowledge, knowledge that came from certain skills such as singing, right, or drawing, but not actual skills which made them aware, politically aware or socially aware individuals. And therefore it became a kind of a feminist enterprise of the 19th century to bring this aspect to women's life, which is to be able to think logically, to be able to reason, and to be able to understand and analyze one's life as best as one could. And you would find that women novelists of the 19th century also tried to do that through fiction, through writing. They were made aware of the circumstances at home in England, which were nothing less than turbulent. And these, in a way, left a mark on these novelists who tried to talk about these aspects and questioned the very idea of an ideal woman, right, or the concept of an ideal woman that was being transferred to them in life through society, through conventions and rituals that they had been practicing. So in a way, 19th century was the century of coming to terms with what was femininity, what was the female gender for these women writers. So you find that as I was mentioning Caroline Bingley, so you find that women were expected to carry themselves elegantly, and they were supposed to be careful of their posture and dress, and basically they were supposed to look pretty. These were meant to gain the attention of suitable men for marriage. Now, 19th century, in a way, let's turn to education. To what extent were women educated, and what was the nature of education? Now, interestingly, 19th century extended the scope of education for middle class women, which was earlier restricted to the upper classes. Now, this is a very interesting point, particularly when you keep in the background the other details of the 19th century, that is the rise of the middle class, which took shape in the 18th century really, and which also brought in with it its own novel form. Now, you must have already realized that the novel form as such is a relatively new form. Before that, there was drama and poetry basically, but novel is a sort of a new form that comes into being in its proper shape in the 19th century. Now, fiction of course had been written earlier, prose pieces had been written earlier, but the novel form, I mean this paper is really based on the British novel, but the novel form as such came up in the 18th century. And with it, now the novel form came up, really speaking, if I could just devote a sentence to it, then it was based, it came on, it came because there was a new class, which was the middle class, that had come into being, that could no more relate to old forms of literature such as poetry and drama, that required its own form. And therefore, the novel is speaks of an individual and has a protagonist, but more often than not, this protagonist is a middle class person, somebody who's emerged from the ordinary rungs of life. And in doing so, you find that the novel is able to create ordinary people as heroes. And so that's the very interesting thing about the novel. So what I'm really trying to say is that there was a lot of social mobility that took place because of the coming up of the middle class in society, because of the emergence of the middle class in society in the 18th century. And you find, because of this kind of a social mobility, women too, who belonged, who were probably married to these barons, these men who were traders and merchants, who probably were able to then hold a kind of a powerful position in society by being heads of factories or owners of these units. And these middle class women then gained the right and of reading. They wanted to be like the upper class women. So you see that kind of a binary that existed earlier between the middle class women and the upper classes, that sort of blurred in the 19th century, because now you had an entire section of middle class women who were trying to extend and expand their knowledge, who were also conscious of how they, what was their behavior going to be, how they were going to converse in society, what would be their skills. So the kind of division between the upper class and the middle class sort of blurred, because now the middle class women had access to all that the upper classes had till now. Now, because of this social mobility, you find that women have also become conscious of improving themselves. So female readership, because education to some extent was also available at this time, limited education, but education of some sort, some basic schooling at home or in a boarding school. So female readership as a consequence increased exponentially in the 19th century. Now that's again an interesting aspect, that 19th century is perhaps the only century where female readership has gone up exponentially, and female writers have cropped up at the same time, and they are the ones who are taking this century forward. I mean, think of George Eliot, think of Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, right? So all these women writers are writing substantial pieces, fiction pieces, and this is a kind of a new development. We'll speak about this in a bit again, but to come back to the point of female readership, you find that female readership rose exponentially during the 19th century. There were already, now there is, you know, if one were to research further, then one might want to go into an entire section of research which is based on women's magazines at this particular time. You find that women's magazines such as the Literary Cabinet or the Literary Companion, meant for basically upper middle class women, floated around, and women were avaricious readers. They had these magazines such as the Literary Companion and the Literary Cabinet. These magazines actually had articles on literature, on the arts, on improvements in domestic life, household tips. So you see how these were read by women, and how they in a way also added to the knowledge of these women. And finally, so from, you know, what I'm really trying to get at is that how when female readership increased, then at the same time writing by women also came to the fore. You know, reading and writing go hand in hand in that sense. So and the themes of these magazines also gradually became vast. They were no more limited to just the arts and literature. They would talk about social life, they would make women talk about religion, also talk about, to some extent, bring in the domestic life, but also politics. They touched upon aspects of how this would affect women. So in a way, these magazines were also gradually shifting focus or becoming more vast as they focused on women's lives during this period. Now, since middle class women, I was saying, had enough time and little exposure of the outside world, remember that there are still these limits that have been imposed on them. We cannot forget the fact that 19th century society was overtly and covertly patriarchal in many ways, right? Women were supposed to follow the code of conduct that was assigned to them, and you find that middle class women therefore had little exposure of the outside world. They had all the time, they could not go out, and again you see there also occurred a kind of division between men and women's roles at this time, because you see when in the nobility or the upper class women, the men mostly worked from home, or they had their extended work in an office in the house itself. But when the middle class comes in, with that comes in the industrial unit, the factory, the workstation, etc., where men leave the household and move out and go out and meet the world. Here in this case, you find that women were left in the house and they had very limited kind of work to do. Of course, these middle class women already had helps in their houses, and therefore they didn't have to do a lot of household work, and yet they had enough time on themselves and very little exposure of the outside world. They didn't know how life was being led. The men in the family would leave them and go out. So they engrossed themselves in reading and as a result writing. But remember, this writing and reading takes place within the patriarchal home, where there are certain boundaries that are set for them. They cannot move out. There are certain kind of jobs that they can take up, for instance, become a teacher or a governess, but they cannot really, as middle class women, they cannot really move out into the circles as men did. So reading and the limited education they received in the boarding houses or through governesses at home worked as a kind of a double-edged sword for women, the upcoming writers, in fact, women writers. While these were meant to teach women grace and submission, right? Women also became grace and submission because this is what patriarchy would have women to believe in. Patriarchy survives on the very logic that women must be made submissive, and that they have all the sort of moral qualities, that they are superior to men in terms of their moral qualities, but inferior to men in terms of their physical attributes or physical strength. So you see, moral strength means that, you know, they can take care of the household better, they have the grace, and they can submit to the authority of the male. So women also, while the literature that they read, mostly conventional literature and traditional literature that they read, while this kind of literature made them, or was supposed to make them, submissive, women also became aware of their social, legal and political inequalities. Because remember, what cannot be forgotten really is that the French Revolution was just around the corner. I mean, we are speaking of 19th century women, but 1789 and beyond brought a new kind of world to them, where you know, a revolution had occurred in France, which is like, you know, which is almost like England and France are always competing with one another, and they are like this kind of frenemies, so to speak. So, you know, something that occurs in France has ripples, sends ripples down in England, and whatever happens in England also affects France. So it's that kind of relationship, and you know, it was almost certain that England would see its revolution in the 19th century, but it was somehow contained through the reform bills and other things that took shape and came up during this period. And so what I'm really trying to say, that once they have a neighbor and a country that they are keeping a tab of, once there is a revolution there, it rocks the foundation of English society. You know, women also begin to question why they are not given this kind of equality, right? Remember, the series of reform bills that take place from 1832 onwards, these are based on you know, giving voting rights to more number of people. So the entire British electoral system changes because of these reform bills. If reforms had not been introduced in England in the 19th century, it is quite certain England would have seen a revolution on its turf, as France saw. So in order to avoid a revolutionary situation, England gave in to the demands of the larger populace that wanted voting rights for itself. So voting rights were extended to certain boroughs and certain households in England. Earlier, only certain upper classes could vote. Now the voting rights were being extended. Now when the voting rights are being extended to people around, women questioned why were they kept out of it. No matter which strata they belonged to, they were always kept out of this kind of a voting right, kept out of voting rights. And you know, you could see the roots of the suffrage movement also, women's suffrage in the 19th century. You could see the roots of that movement, which finally becomes a reality for women in the 20th century. But in the 19th century, you know, there is already this kind of a disruption, or this kind of a you know, disgruntled women you have here who are questioning these ideas. So women, a lot of women who had gained education, who had who had very little work to do otherwise, who had no exposure of the outside world, but had become aware of their social, legal, political rights to some extent, many of them turned to writing about these. Now, women began to represent in fiction, therefore, particularly the discrimination they faced at each stage of their lives. The trend had actually already been set in the late 18th century when Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman appeared in 1792. Now, if you remember, Mary Wollstonecraft, who is the mother of Mary Shelley, again a very strong 19th century writer, Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792 wrote a treatise, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, that highlighted the need to educate women along rational lines on par with men. Wollstonecraft believed that keeping women away from science, mathematics, politics actually stunted their growth and affected entire human civilization. Now, Wollstonecraft's idea was basically that because women are nurturers of a new generation, because they give birth and they teach and they are the first teachers of a child, if you keep them away from the basic tenets of rational thought that come from science, mathematics and politics, then you are actually stunting the growth of an entire civilization, because they are responsible for the next civilization. So they should also get this kind of education which men get. So of course, that was one way of putting it, but what she was really doing was to put forward this idea of women's rights and women's education. Again, what boosted the confidence of women writers during the 19th century, making them question the norms that worked to their disadvantage, all the time, were a series of these social reforms that I have just mentioned that took place in England. And George Eliot, who you have in this syllabus, would also write about these in Middlemarch. She talks about the reform bills and the protests that take place in Middlemarch at length. So you will be able to connect these historical movements with the texts which are there in your course. So the first half of the 19th century, really speaking, was fraught with various challenges. There were agitations and reforms that were taking place. There was social unrest and economic crisis taking place in England, right? And also in Europe at large. Now add to this that there were the new kind of scientific inquiries that were being made at the time, and Charles Darwin's contentions in The Origin of Species made women reflect on their own evolution. I mean, Charles Darwin came in and said that, well, and therefore he discounted and he dismantled the entire theory of creation, right? Women also began to think of these aspects, and they took to fiction to interrogate the given and the assumed norms in society that they had been accepting as truths till now, and they realized that they need to also question these truths which are given as truths to them, but maybe are just norms, and they need to question the very foundation of knowledge, just as Darwin questioned the very foundation of our creation and the logic around creation, and suggested and found something else and was able to justify this kind of evolution theory. So all these ideas, be it in the field of science or philosophy or economics, you see in 1848 you had Karl Marx come in and tell the workers to break their chains. Again, the idea of protest and revolution and rebellion is very strong in post-French Revolution and is running through the entire continent of Europe. So England could not obviously remain untouched by it, and these in a way gave a boost to women's movements in the 19th century. Now, in this background, try to place the woman writer. This is what the woman writer had to face: a patriarchal society where they were beginning to question social norms, where everybody around them was questioning how society was so far being led, and where protests were happening every day. And women writers then also wanted to come into the sphere of writing. Now, writing as a domain was not a woman's domain. As I told you in the beginning, women were supposed to read, but not enough. If they turned into too much of an intellectual, then they would be seen as unnatural and unfeminine. So women writers actually felt very apologetic about writing itself, because they were infested by this sense of self-doubt, since by choosing to write, they were actually leaving their femininity aside, right? In choosing to write, they were leaving the femininity aside and entering a world which was almost entirely dominated by men. It was men who wrote, men who were intellectual, men who knew things, and men who could comment on things. They also felt inferior to male writers and were turned into a subject of ridicule by them. You know, if a woman wrote, then she would become a subject of ridicule among male writers. She would be seen as a kind of a barren writer who was either copying them or had nothing original to say. So women actually had to justify their writing all the time in this period. And in any case, the female writer held second place to the male literary writer who wrote with elan and authority and moved around freely in literary circles and made a name for himself. All this was unavailable to women. Women were entering a domain that was a masculine domain, that is the domain of writing, right? And in doing that, they had self-doubts about their own selves. So women novelists in the 19th century faced this important question: should they represent women in fiction as men had been representing them, or should they carve the characters after their own heart? Women writers often aped men and copied their style and representation, and in doing so they were termed intellectually sterile for lack of originality. Now, what I mean to say here is that really, if they lacked originality because they were aping men, right? Because they were imitating men, right? And in imitating men, they were trying to fit in a culture that was absolutely hostile to them. And if they actually went on to talk about their own, what they wanted to represent and what they wanted to talk about, then they would not be accepted in society. So it was a kind of a catch-22 sort of a situation for women at the time, right? So, interestingly, G.H. Lewis, who was a partner of George Eliot, he wrote this essay, The Lady Novelists, in 1852, and there he says, to write, and I quote, "To write as men write is the aim and besetting sin of women. To write as women is the real task they have to perform," end quote. Now, what Lewis really meant by this quote was that women were constantly trying to imitate men, and that was their besetting sin, and that they had to come out of this mold, and they had this real task which was to write like women. Because they were writing like men, therefore they were being unoriginal also. But remember that women who created, say for instance, strong rebellious characters, female characters, they received flack and criticism from society. Women writers who wished to write original works found a culture inimical to receiving it, right? If they chose to write as women, their fiction had to stay within the moral religious framework, or their works would be considered blasphemous. In nutshell, what I'm trying to say here is that they could choose to be angels or be seen as monsters, and there was no middle ground for them. Right. So this was the real predicament of a woman writer. Should she write like men? In writing like men, she's merely aping them and is seen as a kind of a sterile, intellectually sterile woman writer. But if she went on to write her own, ghosts and her own monsters that came to her mind, and wrote her original stuff where there were women who were strong characters, think of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, right? Now you find, they were not accepted in society. They found the culture to be inimical and hostile, and the people critiqued their works for being heretical and whatnot. So there was no middle ground for women writer, and it was a sort of a challenge they had to face. Therefore you find that women writers often did not write under their real names, for fear of censure. If they wanted their works to be taken seriously, they had to use male pseudonyms, and thus you find that these famous women writers that you have in course also, such as George Eliot and Emily Bronte, they were felt compelled to use male pseudonyms, right? They had to use male pseudonyms so they could be accepted in society, so people would read them and would take them seriously. Other writers of note in this period like for instance Jane Austen and Mary Shelley, they actually used their own names to write. Of course, they had their family sort of. Jane Austen obviously had a kind of a good family, upper class sort of a breeding. Mary Shelley was already a daughter of intellectuals, so they didn't need that kind of backing. But a new writer like Emily Bronte felt the need to write by using a male name to publish her work so that she'd be taken seriously. So this in all has been, these are the predicament of a female writer, the woman writer or women's fiction in the 19th century. Some of the points that you would find, I also want to touch upon very briefly on the recurrence of certain patterns and themes in women's fiction. Now, you will all find, we will in the course of our discussion discuss them vis-a-vis Emily Bronte in particular, but it is good to remember these recurrent themes that you find in the works, right? To begin with, one, you must remember that there are the use of male pseudonyms. Why are women feeling compelled to use male pseudonyms, right? Then the themes really that you will find in a lot of these women writers in 19th century, these include transcendentalism and mysticism, for instance, right? Now, transcendentalism and mysticism, these are these you would find in various shades in women writers. They get connected to also the discourse of society and nature, for instance, because how are women going to deal with this question of society? What is social and what is natural? The debate of cultural and natural also. What is given to us is natural, and what we build on this person is the cultural social self, right? So there is this kind of mysticism which gets attached with nature, also with the view that women have a kind of intense spirituality that you find in them. Then there is the novel of you will find that there will be novel of sentiment and observation. There will be these women writers of the 19th century were very strong on observation, because they only had very limited number of people to interact with and to move around with, so they observed them and their lives and could write about them. And of course, there is a sense, a level of, say, sentimentalism in their works that we find. So, and along with this is the idea of femininity, right? Their understanding of womanhood, their understanding of their own self as women, what did they think of this idea of femininity? How are they exploring it? Are they stretching the boundaries? Are they offering a comment on it, right? And finally, there are questions of faith and God and the role of religion that religion plays in their lives, and attached to it is the idea of human will, the frustrations and the anxiety of this person who exercises human will, right, and then has to face this challenges posed by society when one exercises human will. And you will find in the 19th century fiction also a lot of Gothic element, right? So the Gothic in a way is used by women to depict this kind of frustration and anxiety also, and to show this hysterical side of women. Again, they have deep roots in society itself. And so in order to escape, the idea of escape also is an important idea in this fiction. Women's fiction in the 19th century deals with this idea of escape in various ways: escape through death, escape through running, escape through hiding, and taking another form. Again, the Gothic comes in. So all in all, you will find that these ideas and themes would be floating around in 19th century women's fiction, and this is what makes them, their fiction, their very own. And we'll look at these when we discuss Wuthering Heights in particular in the following lectures in this series. I hope you've been able to make sense of this lecture. I'll see you again later.